Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, a partner here at Cimpatico Studios. Cimpatico is a platform dedicated to cultivating conversations and actions on complex social issues with professionals all around the world. On the Climate EDU channel, I interview academics about university programs, careers, research, internships, and published literature like books and papers. If you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to Climate EDU. I am your host, Kayla Hathaway, and today I'm joined by the lovely Monica Sanders. She is a professor researching equity and addressing climate change and disaster response at the University of Delaware. She also teaches disaster law and hazard economics at Georgetown University Law Center, and all of her work focuses on equity and inclusion. In this episode, she's going to be discussing her recent publication, Equity in Addressing Climate Change, Using Law and Policy to Serve Frontline Communities, which focuses on how some communities are marginalized socially and legally, and why that means some communities won't be able to adapt to climate change without significant help from the government. Monica, thank you so much for joining me today. How are things on your end?
Thank you for having me. Things are great down here. We've had a lot of great news today with respect to climate change and environmental issues with respect to appointments. So I'm excited about that and excited to be talking to you tonight.
Yeah, and it's a pleasure having you on. I've been looking forward to this episode for quite some time, so I'm glad we're finally getting to it.
Yes.
All right, so we'll just dive right on into this. So with this recent publication, my first question for you is why are you interested in this kind of research?
I am a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, which should come as a surprise to no one who's watching or listening that it is a disaster and climate change vulnerable place.
Mhm.
And I'm also a survivor of Katrina. So my early experience going into the law was actually starting law school a month late because of lockdowns and curfews related to the storm. And I came to the realization that this was something that was not going to stop for me and people in Louisiana or anybody in a vulnerable community. And so I decided to direct my research and my legal work to helping people in vulnerable communities understand the risk and the threats around them with respect to disasters and climate change, and also to recover better.
Mm. And I remember when you were telling me just initially about oh yeah, having to figure out college in the middle of a cyclone disaster site, just mind blowing for one. And I'm glad that you were able to make it work.
Yeah, I reflect on that and I think I was like, how many people got to walk away from that and go to graduate school?
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things, it's sort of, kismet or whatever you believe in. I think this is the direction I was supposed to go in. So I'm just going to go. I'm not going to fight it. I'm just going to take this on and see what good I can do. And here we are.
And here we are. And with this publication, so it was published in the journal. Okay, I have my note, Traumatology. There we go. And
A special edition on race and vulnerability from the American Psychological Association.
yes, so if you can tell us a little bit about this journal and how your paper fits into this publication.
So this journal is a special edition, and it was taking into account all of the events that we were looking at this year, because it's been quite a year, right? We're living in a pandemic, which is a disaster. We had the most insane hurricane season on record. We ran out of names. We got pretty deep in the alphabet too. And then also we had a renewed and extremely intense set of protest conversations around social justice and racial justice. And so the journal editors decided to do a special edition, really looking at the confluence of those things. And so I had the opportunity to say, environmental justice is rooted in race and ethnicity and poverty, and so is climate justice. And so when we're having these conversations, we really need to think about equity, and we really need to think about the communities that need it the most. And so I had the opportunity to make this submission, and it was accepted. And I was really excited to have the opportunity to talk about these communities in a newer way, and to say something quite frank, which is they're left out of the climate conversation, and a lot of solutions that we're talking about aren't being done with them in mind.
And getting in onto the solutions, so starting to dive into kind of like the grit of your paper. Um, you mentioned like the way, like pulling a quote from the abstract, like the way that we enforce or do not enforce laws and policies to address these disparities, particularly in the context of climate change, will shift outcomes for these in all communities. And so I wanted to ask, like, what policies and laws like are you referencing, and like what do you advocate for in like moving forward in the way that we handle environmental justice?
Yeah, absolutely. So during the Trump administration, we watered down the National Environmental Policy Act, which is important in judging the environmental impact on communities that certain government programs, infrastructure programs will have. That disproportionately impacts vulnerable communities. Most of the time, when we decide to expedite an environmental review, it's over some industrial complex. In home state of Louisiana, it's either chemicals or oil and gas or something of that nature, which if you look at a map of Louisiana and you see where the chemical corridor is, that's also a disproportionately African American and indigenous area of the state. And it's some of the poorest people in the state. So making sure that we revisit the NEPA is what it's called in short form, revisit that and make sure that we restore it to its original intent, which was to give strict review to these projects before they're done in communities, is important. We have an executive order that's Clinton era that, 12898, that's meant to bring environmental justice in the consideration of federal agencies. I think should we not only start enforcing that executive order in agencies, that maybe it's time to give it a look in terms of giving it legislative strength as well and adding more power to it. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about immediately. And then also, whenever we talk about these communities, Fair Housing Act, which says there's be no discrimination housing policy. So when we do things like adaptation and managed retreat, making sure that when we move neighborhoods or infrastructure around, that we're being equitable about it and we're thinking about the people who are poorest and the people who don't necessarily have the finances to self-mitigate.
Mm. And so going through to define like the terms used in your paper, so mentioning the frontline communities that are being disproportionately affected. And so how are you defining frontline communities in regards to this research?
So when I was researching, it was such an interesting exploration of the terms we use because there are some researchers very validly saying frontline communities are people who are physically seeing the impacts of climate change the first. And so there was a reference to this community in Italy that were really watching the glacier near their home shrink, which I thought was shocking. I can't imagine walking out of my house and seeing actually less of a natural environment in my lifetime than was there before. So that's one way of looking at it. When we're talking about it in our context, we're people that I determine are frontline communities, and the researchers who use it in the same way are people who feel the impacts of climate change first. People who are losing livelihoods in coastal areas because of changes in our oceans, because of pollution, because of changes in industry. They're the first to feel it. When we're talking about a pandemic and the people who are dying first and the most, disproportionately communities of color, that's a frontline community. God, when you look at the images and the pictures of the Navajo Nation, the Dene people,
Yeah.
that's a frontline community. They are fighting the hardest on this pandemic and are seeing the worst impacts of it more than any of the rest of us. That's what I mean when I say frontline community.
And so commonly talked about, like mentioned, like I when I hear like frontline community, I often think of like people along the coast, like oh like their seawater rise and cyclone impacts, like coastal erosion. But notice that there's um not much discussion about rural America. And I'm curious about like how rural America, like what their vulnerabilities look like in this context.
When you're right, we don't think about heat. We don't think about droughts. We don't do as much reporting. There's a lot of good research about Tornado Alley and how the tornadoes are different now, just like hurricanes are different now. We don't think about changes in crop cycles, that as we have these extended winters and summers and the weather is more erratic because of climate effects, that really does have a serious impact on the breadbasket of the country, which is a disproportionately contains most of our rural areas. Parts of the South have big chunks of our rural areas. And so we're missing some signals in the market when we're talking about rural America that are telling us that from visuals and reporting and where we spend the most money, it's our coast, but actually there's some more subtle but equally dangerous signals coming from rural America. That's also, again, some parts of the country that are the poorest and also have the least amount of infrastructure and the least amount of access to political apparatuses to really advocate for themselves and to share this information. So there's a lot of quote unquote opportunities to work with frontline communities in rural America. And we should be doing it. We have to.
And so, with the new administration being rolled in, we get the cabinet appointments. I'm curious, like, what does like your wish list look like for the first 100 days of this administration for environmental justice?
I would like for somebody to log on to the Harvard Regulation Tracker and find all of the environmental regulations that have been rolled back.
It's like, put him back. Put all of it back.
All of it back.
Yeah.
All of the ones that they roll back have horrible impacts, and there are hundreds of them, ranging from looser pipeline laws to approval of certain chemical facilities. So yes, first log on to that if you're listening. Whoever's going into the Department of the EPA or CEQ. The next one is go back and look at HHS's role in emergency nutritional assistance, emergency housing assistance, healthcare, childcare. Because when we have an event and we're thinking about vulnerable groups, we haven't talked about people who aren't documented or have legal statuses that aren't US citizens and can't apply for certain kinds of benefits, particularly in a disaster. Revisit how we do that, because we lose track of so many people every time there's a major event. And we push so many people into more poverty and vulnerability for no good reason. It's just an administrative review that needs to happen and to have different policies. It's not even a legislative action. It really is something that you can do in the first 100 days. It's not a big lift that could help a lot of people. Go pick up and dust off that executive order. Also remember that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is about non-discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and now thanks to Supreme Court, gender expression and sexuality. And make sure that when we're doing assistance for people and we're doing our climate change planning and our disaster planning, that's inclusive. Like, I recognize when this administration comes in, it's going to be a little wonky because this isn't exactly a normal transition in a year
Yeah.
that's given normal.
Yeah, there's a lot of like I was looking, I'm like, man, maybe we should give them like the first 200 days just because there's so much stuff to deal with this the moment it's in there.
Right. So I'm like, I know that there's a much more complicated wish list that I could put forward, but I was like, these are things that you could actually do from your desk, or heaven forbid, they might still be on Zoom like us, that you can actually do from Zoom
Yeah,
and get done that would like make a lot of headway. So I would like to see some good faith, low hanging fruit type activities that can give the people who are in this work um, more bandwidth and a stronger foundation to stand on to help people.
and so going I wanted to, sorry, I'm studying over my words. My brain's going so much faster than my mouth can right now.
See, I love thinking when we do these things.
Yeah, I'm like, oh wait, there's this and this and this. Okay. So when we were defining frontline communities, I also wanted to ask you a question. I'm like, just like, what is like the core legal reason for this type of marginalization? Like we hear the history about like redlining and that, but is that still, well, we know it's still happening, but I'll still ask the question anyway. Is that still happening today?
Yeah.
And on like what kind of scale and like how is that really affecting the environmental justice scene?
Yeah, it still happens. And look, one of the things to think about with redlining is that we had the Fair Housing Act come along and a number of Supreme Court cases, but the policies in lending organizations, the policies in federal agencies are still live and still have an impact on how those institutions act. The detrimental effects in neighborhoods, because redlining is what gave us, highways cutting through neighborhoods and cutting people off from services and transports and things. We never went back and fixed that. So we haven't adjusted our transportation or infrastructure or any of the policies that exacerbate or continue the legacy of redlining. So those things still happen. God, when you talk about what happens to communities that were redlined, is everything from urban heat island effect to now extreme cold effect because of no greenery or nature-based protections from those things, to in the environmental justice seeing properly, having what I was saying about chemical plants, factories, other industrial plants are disproportionately put in those kinds of neighborhoods. Whereas, interestingly, as we start to visit clean energy and alternative energy, those are put in higher income, less redline neighborhoods. So there's a conversation around just transition from coal and petrochemicals about saying, like, look, the dirty business shouldn't be centered totally in Black, brown, and poor neighborhoods. And the clean business shouldn't be disproportionately centered on higher income patches of land with a different demographic. Like you need to spread the risk and the benefits around. So those are just a couple of the facts that frontline communities get, along with, globally cheap land is near the coast, and we know what happens on the coastline with sea level rise and cyclones and hurricanes. And so all of those things are still just cascading one and another on top of these people.
So it definitely sounds like a lot of this, it's not impossible to change, but it requires a lot of pen and paper work and making sure that it's actually enforceable. And I'm curious, so what would, because I think you said called NEPA or NEPA, however it's pronounced, like it's commonly referred to as a paper tiger, um, and then we also have things like Paris or Kyoto, which are also like, oh, it's a paper tiger. It would be nice if we would do these things. It would be nice, but it's not.
Yeah.
How would we actually enforce this kind of policy? Like, what would it look like?
Well, the thing about with our global agreements, they're just that they're voluntary, they're honor based. It's not a treaty, it doesn't have the effect of law, which is why we can, enter and leave the room as we please with Paris and some
Yeah.
other ones. We don't socialize it. So a good alternative, example is the Sendai framework with environmental sustainability goals and all those things. If you ask an emergency manager there in California, they know what Sendai is because even though it's not law, they exercise it, they include it in their planning, they think about it in their response. So Sendai is a real thing and it's getting real benefits because it does have the effect of law and it's socialized and it's something we think about. With respect to NEPA, yeah, it's a review requirement on the agencies and it's unevenly enforced. And things like that it is the law, it just needs that division of the EPA that works on it needs enough people to do the reviews to confirm that the reviews have been done properly. I know nobody likes to hear the term we need more lawyers, but we need more lawyers that analyze.
Those dang lawyers.
Like no one wants to hear like we need more lawyers. But we need more lawyers in EPA to actually make sure these things are being done correctly because yeah, unless you staff and are intentional about enforcement, it does become a paper tiger.
Yeah, I remember because I was telling you like recently graduated in May, but I had to take a class on environmental law and learning about NEPA and I'm like, "Oh, wow, like this is great. There's so much good stuff in this." And
Mhm.
then my professor who's a lawyer followed up and was like, "Yes, but hardly any of this happens." I'm like, "Then why is it in law? Like this doesn't make sense."
Because we wave it right and left and center. And definitely when there's a disaster, like after declare the disaster and we need money, once you get into the recovery phase, governors and mayors and other municipality leaders will say, like, can we waive NEPA review so that we can hurry up and get this built back because we need to house and get businesses started and infrastructure back up. So at the time when you really need to be thinking about what you're doing the most, and you need NEPA is when we waive it out of thinking it's the fastest way for a good outcome. And so yeah, every time we have a big storm or something like that, those reviews get waived. And then there's also the corporate manipulation
Oh yeah,
in some of these situations where it just does not happen. And so it's a just law that's not being enforced. And, some people are like, we should have something else or we should repeal it. I'm like, we could also take it seriously, staff properly, enforce the penalties that were intended to be associated with it and make it something real. Like we can, it's written law, so we actually have the opportunity to enforce it properly.
Yeah, and it also just sounds like it would be less taxing, like not like taxing as in like taxes, but taxing as just like the stress of like, oh, well, since it's already written and it exists, just put people in it as opposed to let's go and try to write an entirely new legislation with our current Congress.
Right.
And good luck on that one.
Exactly. Like, let's go through the whole exercise of writing some broad sweeping environmental law
Mhm.
and get it through this Congress, which, I know a lot of people are really looking to Georgia, but I was like, that's a seat and it will shift a majority. But the amount of incivility and contention and just unwillingness to collaborate, that's not going to go away with one state. I'm sorry to disappoint. And I don't mean any disrespect to the people who are working hard on turnout in that state. Like, I appreciate you, I really do. But there is a stain from all of this fighting and just a really nasty and ineffective way of doing business that I don't think is going to go away on midnight of January 19th.
Yeah, no, like it's the activism like I was saying like the activism didn't end the moment Biden got like elected, and activism doesn't end once we go and get these Senate seats. Like this was a common thing in my like communities that I'm in for climate discourse. Like, well, I guess now we just have the opportunity to go and bully Biden and his administration. And they might listen. That's the thing. Like they might listen, and that's better than not listening at all.
Right. And I was so excited when I saw that Belinda Mallory got CEQ because she's an environmental lawyer from the Southern Environmental Law Center. And I was like, oh, it's one of our own who really thinks about environmental justice is going to be in this important role with a voice in the White House. So activists may need to go bully Biden, but you'll have someone who listens and somebody who might actually like amplify those voices and say like, hey, this is why people are so activated and we need to get activated as well. I
And
hope
on
we'll keep our fingers crossed.
fingers crossed. And on that note, Cimpatico will be here to continue to lift up voices and platform people that need to be platformed, like yourself, publishing these kinds of research and doing this kind of discourse and praxis. And we have also hit our time for this episode already.
Oh, it went so fast,
I
as they
know
always
it
do.
always does. But just hang tight. I'm gonna go ahead and roll the end credits, and we'll hang out and just chatting in just a moment.
Okay, sounds good.